Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ask the Stud 7. Wow, we've had so many great questions here. We got another one for you today, another great one. A lot of really good questions again. And I want to thank everybody for coming on with us and watching these on YouTube. We have a great one here for you today. We got questions from everywhere. We even got one from the Caribbean down there. So we're looking forward to it. And thank you so much for coming back. This is Ask the Stud 7. And we're going to get right into it.
Our first question is from Todd Flynn in Sevierville, Tennessee. Where did the term mark come from, and is that a derogatory term?
That's a great question, and everybody uses that term, and I know that's probably something that a lot of fans would really have no idea what that answer is. And thank you, Todd, for asking. That's a good question, a darn good question. I think to get the history of that term and that word, you kind of have to go back to wrestling about as far back as it goes, a professional type of wrestling. Before it became popular in big events where you had these two great guys against one another, like they were having in the early 1900s, in the 1910 to 1920 era. The place that most wrestlers learned to wrestle was in carnivals, fairs, and things like that. And obviously, everybody's been to the carnival, and you've been to the fair. And the carnies in the fair, the guys that ran the fair, and the guys that had the booths, and you did the little throw the basketball or do whatever it was to try to win a toy or whatever it was, is they really kind of coined that term. And those wrestlers that wrestled, they always, back in the old days, in my grandfather's day, he wrestled in the fairs, in the carnivals, on what was called the Bally. It was a big, huge stage. They set it out there. Then they had a big barker that tried to draw the crowd around the stage, and then he would say, "We're going to have wrestling here, and we've got the greatest wrestlers in the world, and we're willing to let you see how good you are. And if you can beat one of them, we're going to give you money." So they didn't really wrestle each other. They spent their whole time wrestling. My grandfather said just wrestled the guys that got up that wanted to wrestle them, and they were called what the carnies called all the people, basically just about everybody that came to the fair. They considered them to be a mark. And so that's where that term came from. It is from back in the fair days, back in the carnival days. And my grandfather said that he would wrestle on the Bally on weekends. He said you would wrestle sometimes 5 guys, 6 guys in one day's time, because about every hour and a half, they would have this show. Usually, he said there was about 3 wrestlers. And the fans got to pick the guy they wanted. Now, my granddad was only 5'8", which back in that day, we're talking the early 1900s, so was everybody else, basically. But he said, for some reason, he said, I always got picked. Everybody wanted to wrestle me. He said, I guess I didn't look very tough. And and I asked him about it, and I said, well, how many times did you ever get beat? And he said, never. And and I said, well, was it that important? If you were getting hurt or whatever, you wouldn't give up. And he goes, no. And he goes, if you gave up and you end up the barker having to pay somebody for beating you, he goes, you might as well pack up, because your day's done. If you can't beat everybody that comes up there and they don't know anything about wrestling and shooting, and you don't deserve to be on the Valley. So that's kind of what it is, Todd. That's where the term Mark came from. It came from old time wrestlers wrestling on the Valley in the carnivals way back in the early 1900s, and it's just kind of stuck with the sport from then on. And you ask, is it a derogatory term? In some ways, I'm sure to the carnies it was a derogatory term when they had somebody stepped up and wanted to shoot the rifle to see if he could knock the ducks down or whatever the little deal might be that they were playing at the fair. Then and they look at each other and and they use that term quite often. Nobody knew what it meant. Nobody got upset about it because it was pretty much a carny term. And you didn't hear it anywhere else, and wrestlers kind of picked up on it, and they've kept it ever since.
Our next question is from Shandor Dot. Did you ever entertain the idea of bringing in the Four Horsemen for a feud with Bob Armstrong, your brother Robert Fuller, your cousin Jimmy Golden, and yourself? That would have sold out everywhere.
Well, that's a great idea. And Sandor, I think it was it, Shandor, maybe. The only problem with that is that the Four Horsemen were basically the product of Jim Crockett in the Mid-Atlantic Territory, and that was his four big stars, and he didn't send out his stars to just anybody, and he didn't book his stars out. He used them primarily for himself. Just like once Bob Armstrong became the Bullet, he was primarily a Continental talent and a USA talent. So, in the case of this particular situation here, where you're talking about bringing in Arn Anderson and Ric Flair, and and I think they had more than Four Horsemen. I think they had a couple of other different guys they switched in and switched out. But obviously, those four guys were great wrestlers. And the guys that you mentioned there, and I'm not basically including myself, as pretty darn good wrestlers as well. And I don't think there's any doubt about the last part of your question there. Wow, I believe, obviously, if we could have done those type of matches and they'd have sent the Four Horsemen into us, that we would have sold out every building and every place that we ever ran wrestling, basically. So, but that's a great question, and a lot of people don't realize that stars in the particular territories stayed in those territories most of the time. And those territories were very particular about their stars. They didn't just lend them out to anybody. They got you over, and then they wanted to keep you there and make money from you and off of you as long as they could. So great question, though, Shandor. And thank you very much for your question and for getting involved in this Ask the Stud number 7.
Our next question comes from Elwood Sandridge, Weehawken, Florida. With Eddie Graham's death in January of 1985 and your Southeastern Wrestling Company switch to Continental Championship Wrestling also in 85, was there any discussion of buying the Florida Championship Wrestling Company?
Well, that's a great question, Elwood. That's a great question. And oddly enough, there is some basis that could have maybe potentially happened. Eddie Graham was a tremendous promoter, a tremendous wrestler, a tremendous businessman. He was a one-of-a-kind human being, and he had the Florida territory was one of the greatest territories that's ever been, no doubt about that. And they just tore things up from basically the 40s, 30s, and 40s all the way into the 80s. And around 1980s, and their commentator for most of that time frame especially I guess for the last 20 years before the 80s, was Gordon Solie, who happened to be the commentator for my Continental Championship Wrestling on Mondays. We would do our taping in Birmingham on Mondays. Gordon would fly in there, and then he'd fly back to Tampa, and he would do the Florida show on Wednesdays, every Wednesday. So, Gordon kind of talked to me. First of all, they were continuing to do their program in what was called a building called the Sportatorium. And I'm sure, Elwood, you are familiar probably with that building. You might have been there. That's where they made their TVs. And they always stayed. They never left that building and that facility. But when Gordon first came to Continental's first show and he saw the set and where it was sitting on the stage in Birmingham, and 7,000 people, 8,000 people, it freaked him out. He'd never seen a show produced in a huge facility. With the big trucks and the 5 cameras and all the things that we did with Continental. And he was kind of, as I said, blown away by it. And we had a conversation after the first night, the first show that we did, and he was like, Ron, this is just unbelievable. He goes, wow, you got the greatest product in the country. And then we got into a discussion about the Florida territory. And he said, Ron, this was hard for me to understand too, because I had gone in there in 1970 and started out basically as a rookie, and then, got to be pretty good in the first 4 years I was there. I was only there for 4 years, but ended up winning a couple of championships, the Florida title, the Southern title, and I got to be a lot better wrestler than I was. But that territory was just unbelievable, and it was always full of great talent. And I know you, Mr. Sandridge, I know you're very familiar with the great Florida talent that was there. It was always the best talent, and maybe in the country. And so, I could not believe in this conversation. Gordon says, Ron, we're really suffering. And I said, what do you mean you're suffering? He goes, business is just really gone to hell. And I was like, are you kidding, Gordon? I mean, you still got great talent down there, and what's gone wrong? What's happened? Well, there was a lot of things in this discussion that he and I had, but he basically, after a long conversation with me, he said, Ron, he goes, would you consider coming to Florida and being the booker and running the company? And I said, well, Gordon, I got my own company here, right? I mean, I just got my TV, big, huge TV here, and I've invested a lot in this, and I don't think I can come to Florida. I mean, I just don't see that's going to happen at any time soon or whatever, But I guess, Elwood, you had a good point. I mean, once Eddie died, it went to hell. And it just says a lot about Eddie and the man he was, and how much everybody depended upon him. And when he died and passed, it left that territory in a quandary. They were really in trouble, and they had Dusty Rhodes basically for 10 years, 11 years. Just been hammering that territory, and Dusty's style of booking and especially Dusty's style of work was not the very best for continually strong business. Dusty had his own style. He was great, man. I loved to watch him. I loved to hear him talk. He was a tremendous character. But he was not the type of character that built the territory and kept it strong. So, all of that, and Gordon had the discussion, and I just had to tell Gordon, Gordon, I mean, well, I'm flattered that you would think that, I could really help you down there. But I got my own territory here, and I was quite honest. I said, I don't know that I have enough money to buy into Florida. That territory still got to be worth. Well, he was he was pretty down on things. And, he said, Ron, it's not like it used to be. But it's a great question. Great question. And Eddie Graham, I can't say enough about Eddie Graham. And sadly enough, his son committed suicide years later afterward. And that territory that had been such a monumental one in the history of wrestling kind of faded away. I actually went and wrestled there for them one time. And instead of wrestling, I wrestled in Tampa. And instead of it being in the Army, they had moved into a much smaller building than the Army was. And they only had about, I'm going to guess, 300 people in the crowd. And to me, I almost shed a tear about, wow, how did this happen? How did it go from where it was to where it is at this time? But great question, Elwood. And thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much for questions. And we look forward to hearing from you again.
Our next question is from Thomas Doolittle, Georgetown, Grand Cayman. I heard your recent studcast where you discussed your grandfather and your father's Alzheimer's as a result of punches to the head. I also Googled the photo of Mario Galento and was shocked. Was that match the only time it happened in your father's career?
Oh, wow. Cayman Islands, man. Hello, man. I used to go there. In fact, I ran wrestling in the Cayman Islands in 1981 and 82. For about 3 years, I used to take my wrestlers, my Southeastern wrestlers, down there twice a year. We'd go to the Caymans. I'd take one group for one time and another. And maybe the gentleman that Mr. Doolittle, I think it was, you might have even seen some of those matches. And a great history down there. Those are great wrestling fans in that little island. It's just about 150 miles, I guess you'd say, south of Cuba. And a beautiful island, beautiful place. Love to go there. Love to dive there. Got great diving. My dad had one hell of a match in Mobile, Alabama, in which you saw that photograph of Mario Galento, and I did talk about this in a recent studcast about my father and my grandfather, both doing a lot of hard ways. Hard ways, for those out there that don't know, it means that you really let somebody bust your eye the hard way, hit you in the eye or hit you in the nose and break your nose and black your eyes, and to make the business real. And my grandfather in his day, everybody did it. That's the only way that there was any blood. And then it got to be a little softer later on when they could use blades. But my dad believed in and still believed in the hard way. And he had this first match set up with a guy named Mario Galento, and he decided that they were both going to do hard ways. They were going to just bust each other up, which they really did. And then you saw that picture, Mr. Doolittle, and the picture, it's worth 1,000 words. I mean, Mario Galento looked like he'd been in a car wreck. And my dad did too. He had both black eyes. So to answer your question about it, did happen again. It happened in Atlanta, Georgia, 1966. 58? 8 years later, 1966, in Atlanta, Georgia. My dad wrestled Mario Galento. There was no building big enough at that point in 1966 in Atlanta to hold the people. So they booked it into the baseball stadium. It was the baseball stadium. The last year the stadium was there, it was called Ponce de Leon Park in Atlanta, Georgia. And the baseball stadium held probably 30,000 people. The buildings back in those days, the Atlanta Auditorium probably held about 9,000, and that was about the biggest building there was downtown. So Dad and Dad went and with the same thing in mind that he did in Mobile. He had them hardway each other. He hardwayed Mario, and Mario hardwayed him. And in those two matches, my dad did something that probably very few guys ever did, very few promotions ever did. In the match in Mobile, Alabama, he used the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, Joe Louis, to be the referee. And 6 years later in Atlanta, he used Rocky Marciano, who was undefeated world heavyweight champion. So my dad did things in a big way. And they did 30,000 people. In the Mobile, there was more than 30,000 people in Lattimore Memorial Stadium. So in the Mobile match, they busted each other the same way, all the hard ways. And my dad and my granddad died before they were 70 years old. They both died of Alzheimer's, and that came from concussions. Each time you got hit hard enough to bust your eye, break your nose, you got hit in the head, then you more than likely had a concussion. And they had a number of them, no telling how many my granddad had. And I know my dad had, no telling how many too. So it was just what the price you paid back in those days. And wrestlers in those days deserved a heck of a lot of credit, man, for what they did for the fans, to keep the fans interested and to make the sport great. And so great question. And I always so respectful of my dad and my grandfather for what they did for the business, and all the other guys that did it too. I mean, there was most of them did it back in the 30s and the 40s. So, great question, and I hope to come down there and see you again, Grand Cayman. Beautiful place.
Our next question is from David Bishop. Was the Florida Territory where you got to know Bullet Bob Armstrong, or did that relationship exist before that?
Oh boy. Good question. Actually, the first time I ever saw Bob Armstrong was when my dad moved us into Atlanta, Georgia, and became part of the Atlanta Territory ownership, and became a top wrestler there for many, many years. And I saw Bob Armstrong wrestle. That's where I saw him wrestle for the first time. And I don't know if everybody knows Bob Armstrong's history, but he has an illustrious history. My gosh, man, he was a Marine and a very good Marine. I mean, he was the best Marine in his class in Lejeune, and so was his son Brian, which is a pretty remarkable feat as well. Both those two, the Armstrongs, were the best in their class in the years that they were Marines, that they came out of the Marine Corps. Bob, and then when Bob came out of the Marines, he became a fireman. And when I think about Bob, I think you couldn't have had a more, if you were in trouble and you needed somebody to save your life, I'd put my hands in Bob Armstrong's before I think I would anybody I can think of. I mean, he made a tremendous fireman. He loved it. He loved it. But then he got the training for wrestling. And that's where he built his body. He built his body really bigger. He became a lot bigger when he started learning how to wrestle. And then he started wrestling, and he really at that point he got away from wanting to be a fireman. He loved it. He loved wrestling, and he wanted to be a wrestler. So I remember my brother and I standing on the stage in the Atlanta Municipal Auditorium and watching Bob Armstrong. It was the Rookie of the Year in the National Wrestling Alliance in 1966. And we were like, wow, this guy's great. he was great, So basically, that's where I got introduced, and my brother as well, to Bob Armstrong. And then he came into Florida in 1970. I went to Florida. He came in there about 1972. It might have been 73. And wow, he was just a star. He started out a star. He was always a star. And he came in there and just became really, really hot. And I never got a chance to ride with Bob or spend a lot of time with Bob. But we spent time in the dressing room. We talked a lot in the dressing room. We became friends. Obviously, we'd known each other for many, many years at that point, 6 or 8 years before he even came to Florida. And then when we went back in 1975, the year after he left Florida, he came back. He lived in Marietta, Georgia, just outside Atlanta, and I had the Knoxville territory running, Southeastern. I just started Southeastern. It was in my first year, and he got in touch with me and he said, "Ron, I hear you got a territory of your own." I said, "Yeah, sure do, Bob." He goes, "I'd like to come and work for you." And man, the rest is history. I mean, he came and he stayed. I don't think he maybe went 1 year that he did not work for me after he came there in 1975. And he worked for me all the way in through 1988. Never left. He is one of the greatest human beings that ever lived, with Bob Armstrong. And I say that with all sincerity. I mean, he was everything a man should be.
Our next question comes from Craig Brinkley, Bristol, Florida. I'm curious about the town promoters like Dickie Steinborn in Montgomery, Mickey Barnes in the Tri-Cities of East Tennessee, Jackie Welch in Tallahassee, Florida. What did they do and how were they paid? A flat fee or a percentage of the house?
That's a great question. You're getting back in business-wise. This is a good business question. Everybody handled that differently. Some territories didn't have people that ran towns, particular towns. They didn't have many big cities, not enough area or not enough size of the population to do that, to warrant that. And I'm very familiar with this, as a matter of fact, because I was one of those people as well. In 1972, I got sent from Tampa to West Palm Beach, Florida, to run West Palm Beach, Florida. So I know very well the answer to this question. Obviously, there were most of my chores or most of my responsibilities was taking care of the publicity, making sure the newspaper got its articles in there and his ad in there properly, and spelled the wrestlers' names properly, and making sure that the TV station had their tape, and that if they needed anything, and the newspapers as well, they knew to come to me because I could get them wrestlers. They would come and do interviews for them and do articles with them, and even I was doing articles with them at the time. The way they were paid was probably different in every territory, I would say. My granddad is the guy that hired Mickey Barnes. You mentioned Mickey Barnes in East Tennessee. That was probably in the late 1940s, early 1950s that he was doing that stuff. Jackie Welch was out of Tallahassee, and Jackie was wrestling, and he was helping them run Tallahassee. So you handle the advertising, and you try to stay on top of everything, business, building-wise, so that you never had problems with your building, and everything was always set up, and everything was done properly. And I don't know that everybody's deal with the Florida office was exactly like mine, because I never asked Jackie what money he made. Obviously, I never dealt with Mickey Barnes. He was before my time. But I got a percentage of the town. which meant percentage of what the gross gate was. My percentage was about 5%, which was a tremendous deal. It was a great deal for me. But I was at that point becoming a pretty big star in Florida as well, and they wanted to keep me happy. They wanted me to stay there forever. That was their plans, is to get me to live in West Palm, to stay in West Palm, but to go and wrestle everywhere else in the state as well. So you made, some guys made percentages, some guys probably got paid flat rate. I don't know what that flat rate would have been, but this was 1972, and wow, I mean, there were nights when I would make $1,000 or $800 in 1972, and I was just a young guy. It was an unbelievable deal, and that's one reason I loved that Florida territory, and I probably would have stayed there forever if I hadn't have taken a trip to Knoxville, Tennessee, and accidentally watched the wrestling show on television, and changed my life. But thank you very much. Great question, and I appreciate you sending it in, and thank you very much, and hope we get another one from you.
Our next question is from Steve from Twitter. Your recent studcasts have been awesome. I can only imagine how stunned the Knoxville crowd was when Jimmy Golden turned heel on you and your father. Jimmy was a real a-hole as a heel. Did you have to do some convincing to get Jimmy to go along with
it? Well, he was a pretty good heel, I'll tell you that, from the very beginning. Just for people that may not have heard these studcasts, these recent studcasts, is once we had the Knoxville War got started, and we wanted to do something really different to really get the attention of our company rather than the competing company, the Knoxville 5 and All Star Wrestling at that point. And so Dick Slater was the booker for me in Knoxville. And they came to me and they had an idea for Jimmy. He said, you got your family, and what better feud could you develop than within the family, and I thought that was a pretty good idea, and I do remember going and having the conversation. I think it was Steve, that was your name. I do remember having the conversation with Jimmy and suggesting it. Now, Jimmy had been wrestling almost 10 years at that point. He had never been a heel. He'd always been a babyface. And so when I brought it up and said, we want to turn you heel. And he was like, you want to do what? And I said, no, I don't know, man. I'm serious, we got an angle. We got an idea and something that will really help us here, man, to be successful during this war here. So, I think his first time I talked to him about it, he said, give me a week to think about it. And it wasn't a day. He didn't need a day or 2 days. He needed a week to think about it. But then finally he came to me and he said, let's do it. Let's do it. And wow, it was hot. It was one of those finishes, one of those hot finishes in which there was a riot started, and it was a bad one. Chairs and everything was flying. It was outside in the amphitheater, and he had basically hurt my dad. He had been the guy, George Tanaka, and Mr. Fuji was who we were wrestling against. They were managed by George Jr., and they grabbed my dad up, Jimmy suplexed him, and then they picked him up. One held his legs and one held him underneath the arms, and Jimmy went up to the top rope and came off on top of him. And then he fell probably from the height of this desk here to the mat with Jimmy on top of him. Horrible, horrible bump. I thought he broke his back. Terrible, terrible bump. Dangerous. But my dad wanted to do it. A whole lot of history that we've been talking about basically in the last few studcasts and the last probably 10 studcasts since the Knoxville War started. the war kind of required people to do things that they never thought they would. And that's what Jimmy found out here. He never thought he would ever be a heel. And he was so good at it that when we left Knoxville, we went south to Pensacola. He became a heel 2 or 3 times after that. You know, he went back and forth from heel to babyface. And wow, he's a great talent, Jimmy. And he could do either one of them just great. And so it was great for us. And thank you very much for that question. It's a good question. You know, he didn't jump on it. Let's say that. He didn't jump on being a heel right away. But he became a darn good one. I agree with you. He was a pretty big ego when it came to it. He did a good job.
Our next question is from Wesley Rogers, Tellico Plains, Tennessee. You had 3 of the best TV wrestling commentators in the history of wrestling: Les Thatcher, Charlie Platt, and the Dean of Wrestling, Gordon Solie. Please describe the difference in their commentary and how you chose them to work for you.
Wow, that's a good question. And I think I kind of agree. These were 3 great commentators. All 3 of these guys were really, really good. Let me start with my first one, this Les Thatcher. And Les and I Les became my commentator. He was still wrestling, and he actually wrestled some as well as commentated on TV at the very beginning of Southeastern. But Les and I used to ride down the road when we wrestled together in the Florida Territory, both young guys, and we talked about business and how television was important. And Les had all these great ideas that I had never seen anybody do on their television programs. Personality profile happened to be one of them. And we talked about having personality profile. We talked about doing instant replay. Why is it that wrestling programs don't have instant replay? We talked about split screen, where you could see 2 wrestlers on the screen at the same time. We talked about all these different new concepts that had not ever been done on a wrestling program. So when I started Southeastern Wrestling, it was a no-brainer for me. I mean, I wanted Les Thatcher. I mean, we had talked for years riding up and down the road, and I knew that he was totally committed to it. And wow, he certainly was. I mean, he made that Southeastern Wrestling program was awarded. On the beginning of the program, we were awarded by a major wrestling organization as the best wrestling program in the country. And I think we're the best wrestling program in the world, actually. You know, if it's the best in America, you weren't going to find better in any other country, that's for sure. So Les Thatcher was absolutely wonderful. He was great. Second guy that I got involved with is when I left and I sold out Southeastern in Knoxville, and I went to Pensacola. And even before I sold Southeastern, I went down to Pensacola and started a company there in 1978. And I had a Knoxville company and a Gulf Coast company down there on the Gulf Coast. And the commentator that I met that was doing the job had been doing it for years for Gulf Coast Wrestling down there was Charlie Platt. And I spent some time with Charlie. We talked a lot. He had all this enthusiasm. I watched some of his shows. I got some of his Gulf Coast TV shows, and I just sat and watched how he took care of himself, how he presented himself, how he presented the sport, which was even more important. And he just really impressed me. You know, he was a local guy. He lived in Dothan, Alabama, and had been there all his life. Wasn't known in any of the other cities, but didn't make any difference. Your commentator, if he was good, it didn't make any difference. He was going to make your business better. And Charlie Platt was one of those guys that was really, really good. And while he eventually got involved, Well, in 1982, when Bob Armstrong in the match with Ric Flair, where Bob Armstrong was the referee and turned on me. After that, Bob Armstrong turned heel. Charlie Platt was so upset that Charlie wouldn't deal with him. Charlie and Bob he was like Jimmy. We just had answered the question a minute ago about Jimmy. Bob was a bigger a-hole than Jimmy. He was fantastic. I mean, he was phenomenal. And got to be so bad that we had a second commentator, a guy named Rick Stewart. And a lot of times Bob would come out there and he'd start to give Charlie Platt a lot of gruff and, giving him a hard time. And Charlie would say, "He's yours, Rick." And he'd just leave the set. And it got to be a thing. I mean, Charlie became a big star because of the way he didn't deal with Bob Armstrong. And Bob was really overbearing, and wow, he was tough on Rick Stewart and the commentators and on the wrestlers, on everybody. So that's how Charlie Platt got there. And I don't need to say much about Gordon Solie. Went there in 1970. He was doing the Florida TV show. They had at that point the best wrestling show in America, undoubtedly. And part of it was because of Gordon Solie. And Gordon's greatest attribute, I always thought, was his knowledge of the human anatomy. He knew every muscle and every bit of where the pain would be, and he described it so well that nobody did that. Nobody in wrestling, no commentator anywhere you ever saw or ever went, St. Louis, other territories, there was no comparable to Gordon Solie. And Gordon was just really, really remarkable. And I agree, to me they were three of the best I could have ever had. And wow, they did such a tremendous job for me. I already talked a little bit earlier in this Ask the Stud number 7 here about Gordon Solie and how good he was. And so great question, and I'm glad you called in. I'm glad you contacted and left us this one, and hope you come back with another one.
Our next question is from Gary Reynolds. The podcast you recently did with Dutch Mantell was by far the best one they ever did. I heard you talk about wrestling Ernie Ladd 2 times, and I can't believe Dutch didn't ask you who was taller and by how much.
That's a good question. And I might have wrestled Ernie 3 times. I get to thinking back, and I have this chart of my matches. And it's pretty complete, and I think that I discovered the 3rd time I wrestled Ernie Ladd, but I guess pretty much everybody out there probably has heard about a guy named Ernie Ladd. He was a professional football player. Wow, one of the best, Hall of Fame professional football player, Hall of Fame wrestler. He was a star among stars. He was as big as you get when you talk about stars. So I wrestled him in Mobile. I wrestled him in Biloxi, and I wrestled him in New Orleans, Superdome. And what a great athlete he was. A tremendous athlete, and a great talker too. Wow, he was. I'd have loved to have him in my territory rather than just having him show up in Mobile one time for me. And I went twice and worked for Bill Watts in Mid-South to work with Ernie. And to answer your question, we stood eye to eye. I think Ernie was 6'9". I think he was exactly the same height I am, and considerably bigger. From playing football, and obviously big body, grew up big. Probably was probably the biggest kid in the school all his life. So but a great guy, a great wrestler, a great talker, wow, we drew huge crowds. I mean, we sold out every building we ever wrestled in. I don't know if the Super Bowl was sold out, but I gotta expect, I never really got the exact figure, but it's probably 35,000 maybe in the Super Bowl in New Orleans. So, thank you very much. That's a great question. And Ernie and I think about the same height.
Our next question is from Rick Boggs. Do you remember the first time you wrestled in Knoxville?
Whoa, yes, I certainly do, Rick. There was a lot of apprehension on my behalf. I had made a deal with John Kazana, who had owned the territory, owned Knoxville. It was no territory at that point. We turned it into a territory. But I had made the deal with John Kazana to buy him out. I had never wrestled in the town. I had never been seen by anybody there. And not only that, but it was my very first match as a heel in my life. I had went there to look at the talent and meet a few of the guys. And one of the guys that was a big star in Knoxville that had luckily come to Florida. Every year he came and spent a couple weeks down there, was Ron Wright. And Ron Wright had been the biggest heel in the territory for John Kazana for many, many years. And I don't think he was ever a babyface until I came there. And I sat down with that night with Ron Wright, and I saw the talent that was there. And I said to Ron, I know you've been a heel here, for a long, long time. But I think, that I need to be the heel in this town. I'd like to be able to heel here, and you're going to be the top baby face. I'm going to call you my number one hillbilly, the number one hillbilly. And he said, Ron, he was like, oh, wow, I don't know nothing about baby face. I said, well, Ron, you can do whatever. You know that. You can wrestle in your style. It won't be a problem. I think this is the way I think we need to start this company. I said, later on, I'll turn baby face. We'll figure out a good way to do it and turn you heel, and we'll swap places. And we didn't do that for about, for more than a year and a half probably before we ever turned. But so that's basically how Ron Wright and I kind of got involved and what a great experience for me, man, as a young kid. I think I was at that point, I think I was 24 years old, and I had just purchased a wrestling company at 24 years old. I mean, nobody ever done that in history before or since, I don't think, at that age. And so it was a very, very it was a hard night. It was a hard night for me. I sat in the dressing room with people I didn't know. I knew hardly anybody that was in the dressing room other than Ron Wright, and I had my good friend Mac with me that came out of Florida with me that helped me buy the territory, buy and create Southeastern, and we at the end of the night sat down. And to make it even worse, it was it was late October, 1974. Not a good time of the year, and the crowd was small. I'll be polite about it. Actually, it was very bad. And I looked at the crowd, and I had expected that business was a lot better. I had never even been smart enough to come and watch a match to see what kind of crowds it had before I bought it. And, maybe it's a good thing for me that I didn't, because there might have never been a Southeastern wrestling.
Our next question comes from Randall Albertini, Ottawa, Canada. At the time of the Knoxville 5, promoters around the country cooperated well with each other. After what happened in Southeastern Territory, why would promoters consider ever hiring these wrestlers?
That's a real good question there, Mr. Albertini, and out of Canada. Appreciate that, man. You getting involved with us and sending questions. I think I've seen your name before. Well, I guess probably the Knoxville War was a totally different type of war than most of them. Atlanta had a wrestling war in 1972, in which nobody got blackballed in that one either. The guys that went with what to call the opposition, Lester Welch, my granddad's brother, my dad's uncle, was involved in that war, and he was a member of the NWA. And Ray Gunkel, his partner, and Ray's wife were going to take over the territory, basically kick him out. And so that didn't happen. And the NWA backed Lester because he stayed with the NWA. They sent him some great talent, and then the other company did very, very well very well too. Ray Gunkel and his wife Ann Gunkel did very, very well too. Their territory, and so when that war ended, it ended by Jim Barnett actually buying out both sides. He bought out Lester's part of Atlanta, and then he went to Ann Gunkel and he bought out hers. Jim Barnett, Australian promoter, brilliant wrestling mind, never wrestled, but was, just Australia, promoted the entire continent of Australia. Brilliant guy. He came in and he said, and he knew something that neither of the other two knew, that Ted Turner, who had a TV channel called WTBS, that Ted Turner was about to get on satellite. And so he went in and bought out the two companies that had been warring for probably 2 years, more than 2 years maybe. And then he went to Ted Turner and said, I want you to take my company on your TBS channel. And Ted Turner ended up himself in wrestling, WCW, Ted Turner. Ted was always a huge wrestling fan. Kind of strange way things go down sometimes, but it was these guys. What they did, I think the difference in them not being all banned entirely is I haven't talked about this to hardly any in my studcast yet, but I'm going to get to it. These guys ran Ronnie Garvin, Bob Orton Jr., Bob Roop, the Great Malenko, Ron Wright. All 5 of those guys were involved in that. And then at the end of the summer of 1979, before I sold the business to Jim Barnett, Southeastern Wrestling to Jim Barnett, they got together and they did a video called Plan B Video. They named the video, and they weren't doing good. They could see that they weren't going to be able to win the battle, and they weren't going to win the fight, and they were going to have to leave. They couldn't make any money in Knoxville. And they decided to out the business. To break kayfabe, and to just every one of them, one after another, in 2, 3, 4 minute interviews, tell everybody what wrestling was all about. That was 1979. If that video had ever gotten out, it never got out until probably, I think, maybe close to 30 years later, before anybody ever saw that Plan B video. But if that Plan B video had ever gotten out, they would have had no place ever to go to wrestle. They could have never got a job in wrestling again. But much worse than that, that video, I think, would have probably killed wrestling. I think wrestling would have never had the 1980s, that spectacular decade. Maybe the greatest decade in the history of professional wrestling, in my opinion, was the 1980s. That decade would have never happened at all because this video would have been the hottest piece of video that in the history of sports. You know, there's people saying, here's what actually we do. Here's what it's all about. Terrible, terrible deal. All the wrestling war, all of it I talk about in Studcast present day, the Knoxville War, dramatic and a tragic deal, but it could have been much, much worse, and that's hard to really believe, but that could have been the end of professional wrestling.
Our final question comes from Twitter from TriStar. Why didn't you try to buy Chattanooga from Nick Gulas when you got Knoxville going? That would have you having all of East Tennessee.
Good question. And the Twitter, we got quite a few questions from Twitter people in this one, and thank you very much, TriStar. It's a good question. First of all, I guess I didn't start like when I got Southeastern started. I had to make a success of it before I'd be even thinking about buying another territory. So I did. I started my company in 1974. By 1978, I was ready to buy a second territory to expand because I felt like I knew how to do it and I could do it in more places than one at a time. So I went, instead of looking at Chattanooga as an example, and one of the reasons in this time frame in 1978, I don't think Nick Gulas would have had, and Harry Thornton would have had any, I couldn't have offered them enough money to buy Chattanooga. They were doing good in Chattanooga. It was an integral part of the Tennessee territory. Main office was in Nashville. Nick and them owned Birmingham, they owned Chattanooga, and they owned Nashville. So they had those three big markets there, and I don't know that they would have even considered selling me Chattanooga because they were making good money out of Chattanooga. And I went down and bought the territory along the Gulf Coast, and I got a much better price and a much better deal on it because it was in bad shape. Chattanooga was drawing money, and I would have had to pay big money to get them out of there. And so I went down to the Gulf Coast, and I dealt with the Fields brothers down there. And because their territory was in bad condition, in bad shape, I got a great deal on it. And it's strange how things happen. Wow, you bring this up. 1985, we'd been to Southeastern down there in Pensacola. We had expanded, and we bought, instead of Chattanooga from Nick Gulas, we bought Birmingham. And that made more sense because we were located in the panhandle of Florida and mostly in the state of Alabama. So now we had Birmingham, Montgomery, Mobile, we had Pensacola, and we had Tallahassee over in the panhandle of Florida, Dothan, Alabama. So, to buy Chattanooga would meant us having to travel from Pensacola to Chattanooga, which is a long trip. And instead, we traveled 150 miles shorter than that and went into Birmingham. So we bought Birmingham in 1980 from Nick Gulas. And again, got a tremendous deal because by 1980, Nick was not only doing poor business in Birmingham, he was doing poor business in Chattanooga as well. His business had died dramatically while ours just grew dramatically because we were handling business in a whole different way than most territories were back in those days. So anyway, we buy Birmingham, and then in 1985 we create Continental Wrestling. We take Continental Wrestling back to Knoxville, Tennessee, and then Nick had sold his Chattanooga to Jim Barnett in Atlanta. Jim Barnett couldn't make money in Chattanooga. He couldn't draw money in Chattanooga. And so he called me and he said, Ron, he goes, you're making big money everywhere you go. You're selling out Knoxville now again. He goes, do you think you can draw people in Chattanooga? And I said, I don't know, but what do you got in mind? And he said, I'll give you half the money if you'll run Chattanooga for me. And so we ended up getting to Chattanooga, and TriStar. We actually ended up running Chattanooga, and we ran Chattanooga through the summer of 1985. I'm pretty sure it was 1985. It might have been 86. But we ran it all summer long. We sold out every night, every time we went there. And Jim Barnett got scared. He called me up and he says, Ron, I don't want you to run Chattanooga anymore. I was like, why, Jim? Geez, we're selling them, they're out. And he goes, I just don't, he didn't really have an answer for me. He kind of hemmed and hawed around, but I got the feeling that, well, maybe he's afraid that we're going to take his town away from him. So anyway, that never happened. But that's kind of the way the business was. Everything started changing in the late 70s. All the territories, lots of them, between 1978 and 1985, most of the territories fell apart. They just they didn't have the right idea, the right concept. Time passed them. They had a lot of older promoters and a lot of older owners that were still doing things the old way, and those companies that looked to improve, and those companies that did like we did and went into a major arena, started shooting TV with 8,000 people instead of 200 in the studio. All those things put them out of business, and but great question, man. Really appreciate you contacting us and sending your question in, and hope to hear from you again. Wow, I want to thank everybody. Geez, I've really enjoyed this. I know I say that every time, but I really do like these. We had some great questions this time. It's amazing how good these questions are, and got to thank those that send in the questions. And for those of you that haven't, you can go to look in my social media sites, Ron Fuller Welch on Facebook, Ron Fuller, the Tennessee Stud. That's where you go if you're not already a member or not a friend of mine. You can go there and like me and follow me there, and you automatically become a friend. And I have Ron Fuller Welch on Twitter. I'm going to be putting out these posts real soon about the next one, which is going to be Ask the Stud 8. My goodness gracious, we're already at 8. And that one is going to be on August the 19th, Saturday, August the 19th. They're always the third Saturday in the month. And I really look forward to having more great questions. Thank all of you for your support and for you going on YouTube and making these shows so popular, man. It's really amazing to me and to everybody else that they have so much interest in these Ask the Stud shows. So thank you all so much for joining me today, and I look forward to talking to you again on Saturday, August the 19th.